Chapter 1. I spent years building a system designed to expose internal abuse. Then my boss removed me legally. My family told me to stay quiet, and everyone assumed I would disappear. My name is Claire, and this is the story of how doing nothing at the right moment let the system deliver a revenge no one could stop. I left a stable job in 2017 because I believed in the story I was being told. I was in my early 40s then, old enough to know better, young enough to still want to build something that mattered. The company was called North Shore Vector, a mid-sized data security firm based in Redwood City, the kind of place that talked about transparency and ethics in the same breath as growth and innovation. They said they wanted someone who could design systems that did not just scale, but stayed honest under pressure. I wanted to believe that kind of place existed. For the first 2 years, it felt like it did. By 2019, I was leading the core architecture of what would become our flagship security platform. I was not just writing code. I was designing how the system would remember. Every access request, every override, every exception left a trace. I built audit trails that could not be quietly erased and compliance logic that forced accountability without needing a hero. I believed the biggest threats always came from inside, from shortcuts justified by urgency from power that thought it would never be questioned. From 2019 to 2022, my days blurred into long meetings and longer nights. I was the one people called when something broke at 2 a.m. I was the one who could explain why a fix would work and what it would cost us later. I did not mind being behind the scenes. I had never needed my name in lights. I needed the system to work even when no one was watching. The changes were subtle at first. A slide deck would go out without my name on it. A concept I had spent weeks refining would be introduced as a team effort. The chief executive, a man named Robert Hale, had a way of speaking that sounded supportive while shrinking the room around you. He would say things like, "This is bigger than any one person," or "We need to stay flexible and not get attached to ownership." He never raised his voice. He never insulted me. He just made it clear that visibility was something he controlled. By late 2022, the platform was nearly ready. Investors were circling. Internal demos were scheduled back-to-back. I was tired, but proud. I had built safeguards into the system that I knew most people would never notice. It required that the creator retain oversight privileges unless a documented review occurred. Not because I distrusted my colleagues, but because power without friction always bends toward misuse. The meeting happened in early 2023. It was scheduled for 15 minutes. Robert was there along with the company counsel, a woman named Patricia Cole. No one looked uncomfortable. There was no sense of confrontation. Patricia explained that the project was being restructured to align with new strategic priorities. Robert added that this was not personal and that my contributions were appreciated. They told me my access would be adjusted effective immediately. They did not fire me. They did not accuse me of anything. They simply removed me from the authorization chain. The language was clean. The paperwork was correct. Patricia slid a document across the table and summarized it calmly. My role was changing. The platform would move forward without my direct oversight. This was standard practice, she said, and well within policy. I remember the exact moment my chest tightened. Not because I was angry, but because I understood what had just happened. Years of work had been separated from the person who built it, and it had been done so neatly that there was nothing obvious to push against. I asked one question about whether a formal review had been conducted. Patricia answered that the leadership team had discretion in these matters. Robert smiled and thanked me for being professional. I walked back to my desk and packed my bag in silence. People around me were busy, unaware that anything had shifted. I did not cry. I did not argue. I felt a brief surge of panic, then a strange calm. Shock gave way to calculation. I knew exactly what removing me from oversight would do, because I had designed the consequences. That night, I opened my laptop at home and reviewed my notes. I did not access the system. I did not try to intervene. I simply reread the principles I had written years earlier, the ones that required transparency when control changed hands. The platform did not punish, it did not accuse. it observed. When the creator was removed without process, the system elevated its internal monitoring thresholds, not to flag a person, but to preserve integrity. Over the next few days, emails arrived that were polite and distant. I was reminded of confidentiality obligations. I was thanked again for my work. Friends inside the company avoided eye contact. The narrative had already settled. This was a restructuring. This was business. I could feel the pressure to move on quietly. I told myself to breathe, to wait, to let the system do what it was meant to do. There was no satisfaction in this moment, only a steady resolve. I had built something that did not rely on my presence to behave ethically. If nothing went wrong, then nothing would happen. If something did, it would not be because I wanted revenge. It would be because rules matter even when the people in charge forget them. When I left the office for the last time that week, the sun was setting over the parking lot. I sat in my car and allowed myself one thought before driving away. They believed the story ended in that conference room, but for a system designed to remember, this was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The days that followed moved more slowly than I expected. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. That was the hardest part. I came into the office each morning and sat at the same desk, logged into fewer systems, included in fewer meetings. No announcement was made. No explanation was offered beyond what had already been said. The company behaved as if nothing had changed, and somehow that made the change feel heavier. Robert continued to stop by my desk from time to time. He smiled the same way he always had, relaxed and reassuring. One afternoon, he leaned against the partition and told me I should not take the restructuring personally, that everyone went through moments like this, that adaptability was the real measure of leadership. He said it in a calm voice, the kind that made disagreement sound unreasonable. I nodded and thanked him for checking in. After he walked away, I sat very still and waited for the feeling in my chest to pass. A few days later, an email arrived from Patricia. It was brief and carefully worded. She reminded me of my confidentiality obligations and asked me to confirm that I understood the scope of the non-disclosure agreement I had signed years earlier. There was no threat in the message, no accusation, just a gentle tightening of the boundaries. I replied that I understood and closed my laptop with more force than I meant to. At home, the quiet was louder. I found myself replaying conversations, searching for moments where I might have misread the room. I wondered if I had been too rigid, too protective of what I had built. I had spent years believing that clarity and accountability were virtues. Now I was being told, without anyone saying it outright, that those same qualities made me difficult. I drove to Sacramento that weekend to see my parents. They had followed my career from a distance, proud, but never quite sure what I did all day. We sat at the kitchen table where I had done homework as a child, and I tried to explain what had happened without sounding bitter. My mother listened with her hands folded, her brow furrowed. My father shook his head slowly and said that companies were complicated, that I should be careful not to burn bridges. He reminded me how long it had taken me to find stability after my last job change. My mother added that peace of mind mattered more than being right. They were not wrong. They were worried. They wanted me safe. But as they spoke, I felt the familiar pull to make myself smaller for the sake of harmony, to swallow the unease and tell myself it was not worth the trouble. I smiled and changed the subject, but the words stayed with me long after I left. Back at work, I ran into Naomi in the hallway. She had been on the project almost as long as I had, managing timelines and smoothing over conflicts I never saw. She asked how I was doing and meant it. I told her I was fine and meant the opposite. We stood there for a moment, both of us aware of what we were not saying. Finally, she admitted that she had noticed my name disappearing from documents, that it did not sit right with her. She lowered her voice and said she wished she could do more, but with her mortgage and her kids, she could not afford to be on the wrong side of leadership. I told her I understood. And I did. That understanding did not make it hurt less. As the weeks passed, the doubt crept in quietly. I started questioning my own memory. Maybe the system did not need those safeguards anymore. Maybe I had been overly cautious. Maybe this was just how things worked at a certain scale. The language around me reinforced that narrative. Words like alignment and efficiency were repeated until they lost meaning. Each time I felt the urge to push back, I reminded myself that no one had technically done anything wrong. One evening, after another long day of pretending I sat alone in my apartment and stared at the wall, I thought about my parents, about Naomi, about the version of myself that had believed in building something better. I realized that the most dangerous part of what was happening was not the loss of control, but the slow erosion of trust in my own judgment. I opened my notebook and flipped through pages of diagrams and notes from years earlier. I did not log into any systems. I did not break any rules. I simply read what I had written when I was clear about why those mechanisms mattered. The logic was still sound. The principles were still there. I had not imagined them. That night I made a quiet decision. I would stop telling myself that this was nothing. I would not confront anyone. I would not accuse. I would pay attention. I would review the patterns, the access changes, the decisions that followed my removal, not to prove a point, but to ground myself in reality. If I was wrong, I wanted to know. And if I was not, I refused to be complicit in my own silence. I closed the notebook and turned off the light. Nothing had changed on the surface. No consequences had arrived. But for the first time since that meeting, I felt steady. The choice to stop lying to myself was small, almost invisible. It was also enough to keep me moving forward. Chapter 3. I began to notice the shift in the system before anyone said a word about it. Not because alarms went off or dashboards lit up, but because things grew quieter in places that used to be noisy. Requests that normally passed through without friction now lingered a little longer. Access approvals took extra steps. The platform did exactly what I had designed it to do years earlier. It paid closer attention when oversight disappeared without explanation. My name is Claire Whitman. I am 43 years old, and I built that system to remember patterns people preferred to forget. Back when I joined Meridian Axis in 2016, I made one decision that never felt radical at the time. I wrote into the architecture a rule that said, when the original architect was removed from supervisory access without a documented review, internal audit sensitivity would increase. No alerts, no flags, no messages to leadership, just deeper logging, longer retention, stricter correlation. It was not a trap. It was a seatbelt, something you hoped never mattered until it did. After the meeting that stripped me of access, I kept my distance. I did not log in. I did not ask questions. I watched. I listened. And slowly signals began to surface. The first sign came in the form of a calendar invite. It was from Legal Operations 30-minute subject line process alignment. When I arrived, the room was already occupied by two people from HR and the company attorney Melissa Grant. Melissa smiled politely and gestured for me to sit. She started by saying they wanted to clear up any misunderstandings about my role transition. Her voice was calm, careful. She reminded me that systems interpretation could vary, and that reading too much into technical behavior could lead to confusion. Then she said something that landed harder than the rest. We just want to be sure everyone is aligned on how the platform behaves so no one draws conclusions that could be inaccurate. I asked her what conclusions she was referring to. She smiled again. Hypothetical ones. I nodded and said I understood, but I also understood what was happening. The ground was being prepared in case the data told a story leadership did not like. If that happened, the safest narrative would be that I misunderstood my own design. When I left the room, my hands were steady. My thoughts were not. Around the same time, talk of the upcoming funding round intensified. Meridian Axis was preparing for a Series C somewhere between 80 and 100 million if the projections held. Executives moved through the office with a sharpened urgency. Investors asked more questions than before, especially about governance and ethics. Artificial intelligence had become a liability as much as an asset, and everyone knew it. One afternoon, I ran into Naomi by the elevators. She looked tired more so than usual. She asked if I had been pulled into any reviews lately. I told her no. She hesitated, then leaned in slightly. There are people asking about access logs. she said quietly. Not engineers. Compliance. I asked her what kind of logs. The kind that show who touched what and when. We stood there in silence as the elevator doors opened and closed without us. Naomi finally shook her head and said she wished things were simpler. I told her simplicity was usually expensive in the long run. The internal review began without fanfare. No announcement, no all-hands meeting, just a series of interviews and document requests that moved like a tide through the organization. People were asked to explain decisions they had not thought about in months. Permissions were traced, overrides were compared. Nothing dramatic, just the slow work of accountability. I was called in again this time by compliance. The man across the table introduced himself as Aaron Lewis and told me his role was to understand system behavior, not assign blame. He asked me to walk him through the logic behind the audit escalation protocol. I explained it the way I always had, calmly, without emotion. It is designed to protect the company, I said. When oversight changes without process risk increases, the system responds by observing more closely. He nodded and took notes. He did not ask me who I thought had done anything wrong. He did not ask me how I felt. When the meeting ended, he thanked me for my clarity. That night, an email arrived from Melissa. She reiterated my obligation to avoid speculation and reminded me that public statements could jeopardize the company. The message was friendly. The implication was not. For the first time, I felt the weight of what could happen if the narrative turned. If leadership decided that the easiest explanation was that I had built something unstable, something prone to misinterpretation, I could lose more than a job. I could lose credibility in an industry that remembered reputations longer than facts. And still, I did nothing. The data did not belong to me anymore. That was the point. It belonged to the system, to the process, to the rules everyone had agreed to when it suited them. If the review found nothing, then I would know I had been wrong to worry. If it found something, it would not be because I wanted revenge. It would be because patterns do not care who is in charge. A week later, I was asked to attend another meeting, this time with senior leadership present. No agenda was shared. As I walked toward the conference room, I realized something had shifted. The conversations around me grew quieter. People looked up, then away. I sat down and waited. At that moment, it became clear to me that the outcome no longer depended on any single person, least of all me. The system was doing exactly what it was meant to do, and whatever came next would be the result of choices made long before I was removed from the room. Chapter 4. The room felt different the moment I walked in. Not tense exactly, but weighted. The long conference table was already half full, laptops, open folders stacked in neat piles. This was not a conversation. It was a reckoning, even if no one used that word. I took a seat near the end, close enough to hear everything, far enough to avoid the illusion of control. Across from me sat the board members, people whose names appeared in filings and press releases, but rarely in hallways. To my left were two attorneys from an outside firm, their expressions neutral, unreadable. At the far end of the table sat Evan Porter, the chief executive. He looked composed, hands folded, jaw tight. No one spoke for a moment. Then the board chair cleared her throat and thanked everyone for attending on short notice. She said the purpose of the meeting was to review findings from the internal compliance review and determine next steps. Her voice was steady. This was not personal. This was governance. The lead attorney began by outlining the process. Access logs, audit trails, override decisions. Nothing sensational, just a sequence of facts. As he spoke, documents were projected onto the screen. Rows of data timestamps, user IDs. Patterns that did not argue, did not persuade, only existed. Evan leaned forward slightly as the first set of findings appeared. His brow furrowed, then smoothed. When asked to comment, he did not deny anything outright. He explained decisions as operational necessities, temporary measures taken under pressure. He spoke fluently, confidently. He had told this story before. When it was my turn, I was asked to clarify the design intent of the system. I stood not because I needed to, but because it felt right to speak plainly. I designed the platform to protect the company from risk, I said. That includes internal risk. When oversight changes without documented review, the system increases its level of observation. It does not assign blame. It records behavior. One of the board members asked if the system could misinterpret normal activity. I shook my head. It does not interpret, I said. It correlates. The room grew quiet. The attorney clicked to the next slide. A sequence of access changes appeared, followed by a series of overrides that bypassed standard review. No names were attached. None were needed. Evan shifted in his chair. For the first time, his voice lost some of its ease. These actions were taken to meet deadlines, he said. We were under intense pressure from investors. There was no intent to bypass ethics. The board chair nodded slowly. Intent is noted, she said. Impact is also relevant. An email appeared on the screen. It had been sent months earlier, confirming a request that had been verbally approved but never formally documented. The sender was Evan. The recipient was the head of engineering. The language was casual. The consequence was not. At that point, something unexpected happened. One of the attorneys paused the presentation and introduced a supplemental document that had arrived that morning. It was an email from Naomi. I felt my breath catch as her words appeared on the screen. She had confirmed a conversation she had witnessed, a directive given in passing to proceed without review. She did not accuse. She simply stated what she had heard and when. Her name was attached. No qualifiers. Evan looked at the screen, then at me. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Naomi had not become a hero. She had become a witness. That was enough. The board chair thanked her for her candor and asked that the record reflect her statement. Then she turned back to Evan. It appears there were deviations from established process, she said. Regardless of pressure, those deviations expose the company to significant risk. Evan opened his mouth, then closed it. The space around him had changed. The options he once had were narrowing. I spoke again, not to him, but to the room. My goal has never been to punish anyone, I said. I want the system to function as intended. That requires clear oversight and accountability. Without it, we are all exposed. One of the investors asked what that would require. I answered honestly. Restoring documented review, clarifying roles, ensuring no one individual can override safeguards without transparency. The discussion that followed was measured. Terms like restructuring and governance were used, authority was redistributed, oversight committees were proposed, no one raised their voice, no one apologized. Evan listened. Occasionally he nodded. Once he tried to redirect the conversation toward future growth. The board brought it back to process. When the meeting ended, decisions had been made. Not dramatic ones, necessary ones. Evan retained his title but not his unchecked discretion. The system would be governed, not commanded. As people gathered their things, Naomi caught my eye from across the room. She gave a small nod. I returned it. There was no triumph in the exchange, only relief. I walked out of the conference room into the hallway where the lights hummed softly overhead. My hands were steady. My mind was clear. Nothing had been taken back. Nothing had been given as a favor. The structure had simply corrected itself. Outside, the air felt cooler. I paused for a moment before heading back to my office. The company would go on. So would I. The balance had shifted not because I had forced it, but because the truth had finally been allowed to stand. For the first time in months, the weight on my chest eased. Order had been restored quietly, deliberately. And as I walked away from the room, I knew that whatever came next would be built on firmer ground. Chapter 5. The days after the meeting settled into something quieter than I expected. There was no dramatic fallout, no sudden collapse of the company, no whispered apologies in hallways. Meridian Axis continued to operate meetings, stayed on the calendar releases, stayed on schedule. From the outside, it probably looked like nothing had changed at all. From the inside, everything had. Oversight committees were formed. Review processes that had once been optional became mandatory. Decisions that used to happen in private now required documentation and consensus. No one announced these changes as a response to what had happened. They were framed as improvements, as maturity. That was fine with me. Real accountability rarely needs a spotlight. Evan kept his title. He still walked the halls with the same measured confidence. But the space around him had shifted. The casual authority he once carried had been replaced with something narrower, more careful. Power once redistributed does not vanish. It just stops pretending it belongs to one person. I returned to my work without ceremony. My role was clarified formally this time. Oversight restored scope, defined expectations written down instead of implied. No one called it a correction. It did not need a name. One afternoon, a few weeks later, I was asked if I wanted to sit down with Evan to talk things through. The request came through legal, polite, and neutral, an opportunity to clear the air, they said, to move forward. I read the message twice, then closed my laptop. I did not need closure from him. I did not need his explanation or his version of events. The system had already done what explanations never could. It had told the truth without asking permission. That decision, the choice not to engage, surprised me with how light it felt. At home, my parents noticed the change before I mentioned anything. My mother said my voice sounded steadier on the phone. My father asked fewer questions and listened more. When I finally explained that things at work had settled, that I had not been pushed out or punished for speaking up, they did not celebrate. They nodded. They accepted it. There was no apology for urging me to stay quiet. There did not need to be. Their concern had never been malicious, only cautious. What mattered was that when I spoke about boundaries, about not shrinking myself to keep peace, they did not argue. They let the silence sit where it belonged. Naomi stopped by my desk one morning with 2 cups of coffee. She did not say much. She did not have to. We stood there watching people pass by the rhythm of the office returning to normal. She told me later that sending that email had been the hardest thing she had done in years. "I did not want to be brave," she said softly. "You did not have to be," I told her. "You just had to be honest." She nodded, then admitted that honesty had come with a cost. Conversations she was no longer invited to, a sense of distance from people she once trusted. Karma, I realized, does not only visit those in power. Silence protects until it does not. Months passed. The funding round closed. Investors praised the company for its strengthened governance. Ethics became part of the brand, not just a bullet point. Meridian Axis did not become a different company. It became a more careful one. As for me, I learned something I had not expected. I had spent so long believing that justice required confrontation, that dignity demanded acknowledgement from the people who took something from you. I was wrong. Revenge is not watching someone fall. It is not reclaiming credit or hearing an apology delivered too late. Revenge, if that word still applies, is reaching a point where you no longer need permission to exist as you are. I used to think strength meant enduring quietly. Then I thought it meant fighting back. Now I understand that real strength is choosing when neither is required. One evening, as I shut down my computer and prepared to leave the office, I paused by the window. The lights in the city were coming on one by one. Somewhere behind me, conversations continued, plans were made, systems ran. None of it depended on me anymore, and that was exactly as it should be. I walked out into the cooling air with a sense of calm I had not felt in years. Nothing had been undone. Nothing had been avenged. Order had been restored in the only way that lasts quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. Before I turned the corner and headed home, one thought stayed with me, steady and unforced. Have you ever been asked to stay quiet to keep the peace? If you have, you already know the cost.